Welcome, everybody. For the next half hour or so, we're going to be talking about evolutionary design and lightweight architecture. The comments are open, so feel free to post any comments or questions that you have, and we'll address them over the next half hour here.
Yeah,
My
or you can
name
say hello.
my name is Anthony Sciamanna. I'm a senior consultant at Industrial Logic. And Amber, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Amber Conville. I am also a senior consultant at Industrial Logic.
All right. So I think a good place for us to get started is to talk a little bit about what evolutionary design and lightweight architecture is and what it isn't. And then if we have time, we can talk a little more about some of the enabling practices and obstacles. But of course, feel free to provide comments and you'll help steer our conversation.
Yep.
So evolutionary design, in a nutshell, is the ability to deliver customer value immediately and continuously while designing and architecting as you go. It doesn't mean you don't do any architecture. It doesn't mean you don't do any design. That's one of the big misconceptions, that you can't do anything before you put your fingers on the keyboard. And that's just not the case. You can do design. You're doing educated design. You're making educated assumptions about what you know about your domain and about the system that you're building, and the same with the architecture, but you're doing just enough to get started. And the other really important point there is that you're also willing to change it when the code tells you to. So you can refactor into better designs. You can refactor, or through retrospectives determine that you need to extend your architecture or make your architecture a little bigger. But it's not spending all this time generating a final architecture, a final design before you deliver any value. And so that's one of the big misconceptions with these ways of working.
Right. Just like with a lot of the other practices that we like to do, it's not really that different from what a traditional old school style team might do of their big upfront design. But instead of doing a big upfront design, we're doing a small right now design. You're still doing all the same steps, but in smaller chunks along the way.
One of the things that we like to show as a good example of evolutionary design is this. I'm going to share my screen here. Oh gosh, give me a moment here. So this here is an image from Josh Karyevsky's Evolutionary Design article that's on our blog, our Industrial Logic blog, and we can share that in the comments later. But this is a great analogy for doing evolutionary design and lightweight architecture, right? So we're not going to build and design and have the architecture to support, right, building the body of the guitar and the neck of the guitar and the fretboard, and then after that building the headstock and the tuning pegs, and then piecing it all together at the end. What we want to do is start with something that is like an embryonic vision of the final product. So even if you have an idea of where you're going, if you have this grand design, and if you know kind of the architecture, if you believe you know the architecture, you need to support that. It's just not starting there, right? It's thinking about how you can do this in an iterative way, and starting small and expanding on it.
Yeah. So if you think about this, what is the actual point of what you're trying to do, right? Figure out what that root is. The root is you want to be able to play an instrument using a string. Well, you don't need a full acoustic guitar to do that. You can get a stick and some nails or whatever. I don't know how to make a guitar, and a string, and people can play that. So that's the actual point. You can start with that. You can get feedback on that and build from there.
I think just like anything in our industry, it takes practice to build the skill. But what's really important is being able to plan and develop that primitive whole. So it's a working feature. That's a working primitive version of a guitar on the left. It's fully assembled,
Let me
but
put it
all of
back
its
up. There we
pieces
go.
are primitive.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a great analogy, because I've worked with a lot of people both in development and product that feel like they can't put anything in front of a customer until it looks like that perfect guitar. And I like to give the analogy of the wash tub bass. I don't know. Let's see if this is. I think I might have to reshare it, but uh, in any regard, the washtub bass is a great example of that image on the left there. And that goes by a number of names because it's used in a variety of cultures and a variety of styles of music. So you can get started with something small. Even if you're not putting it in production, you can get feedback, from beta testers or people who can get feedback earlier that can help tune your approach And what's really interesting is you may end up with something that doesn't look like that, final guitar in the end. So it's actually getting feedback from your users, from your customers early, and that can help steer the direction. And hopefully you end up with happier users because of that.
Yeah, and that's kind of the key. We've talked about it, or we've talked around it a little bit the last couple of minutes, but why would you want to do this? Because if you don't have any customer feedback, if you don't have any deployed working software, you don't know what you're doing. You have a hypothesis and you have not proven it out at all.
I think another big benefit to evolving your design and starting with a lighter weight architecture is it gives you that ability to move quickly because you're not carrying all this weight of excess code and excess complexity with you, especially early on when you're trying to move quickly and deliver frequently. I think back, I was introduced to this concept through extreme programming XP, and one of the principles was travel light. And the idea there is excess process, excess code, excess infrastructure, all of that slows us down. So if we can bring in the pieces as we need it, that's going to help us go faster. And to me, that's the key. Things like evolutionary design and this lightweight architecture is the key to agility, right? It's not frameworks like Scrum and things like scaling frameworks like SAFe. It's these types of practices that allow us to move quickly. One of my favorite quotes is from a person named Craig Lorman, and he defined agility as the ability to change on the dime for a price of a dime. And so that's what I kind of think about when I think about evolutionary design. It allows us to pivot, allows us to move to where the market needs us to move quickly. Think about it's like turning a bicycle around instead of having to turn around a cruise ship, right? We can move quickly, and it gives us that space to innovate, right? If we're planning everything out up front, we can't react to how the market changes, and it's going to hinder our ability to innovate.
Right. Yeah. And I've seen in a lot of places, and I'm sure people watching have seen similar situations where you have to do stuff according to the, trademark standard of what goes on at your company, right? You have to spin up a Redis server. You have to use Kubernetes. You have to have a Kafka messaging thing. You have to use a Spring. Even using Spring at the start sometimes might not be the right way to go, and all of that just adds so much weight and burden to the beginning of the process. You're spending all your time spinning up all these things that you don't even know if you need yet, instead of just, what's the point of what I'm trying to do? Let's make it.
I can give an example of kind of a heavyweight architecture and how it was getting in the way. So not too long ago, I was doing an assessment for a client, and one of the architects that I was talking to was lamenting to me that they had standardized their architecture so that they couldn't release anything unless it was this boilerplate architecture. And what he was telling me was that he said we need to stand up a very simple REST endpoint, few pieces of data from the database, and it's going to be low traffic. And he was saying, we can use Spring Boot and Spring Initializer and spin this up in a couple of hours and have it out in production in literally a couple of hours. They were a Java backend shop, and they knew Java very well, but because it was, process standardization and technology standardization, they needed to use their custom framework. They needed to use event storming. They needed their Redis caching layer. And so something that could have been hours became overly complex and took them significantly more time to implement. So I think that's an example of kind of the anti-pattern. That's what we're trying to avoid. Maybe eventually you'll need that, but when you first are shipping something, and if it's really low traffic, get something out quickly, get that stood up. Your customers are going to be happier to have that capability sooner.
Yep, I agree. And then, the flip side too that I hear a lot is like, oh, I guess we're just not going to do any design. We're just not going to do any architecture, and it'll just be the Wild West. I don't think anybody's advocating for that either necessarily. If you know that what you're working with is like so much data, just petabytes of data, you're not going to start out with a file system.
Exactly.
Form of storage. You make an educated decision, but you're also not going to make 6 replicated databases on day one. That's just it doesn't make any sense.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily do nothing or do everything. It doesn't need to be polarized like that. It's, where in the middle meets the goal that you need without hamstringing you in the future is really the key.
That's right. Yeah. And I think the same goes for design as well, where a lot of people think we just start coding and the design will just come out. And that's not the case. The first XP team I worked on, our office was all of the walls were whiteboards. So we would go to the whiteboard and we would do design so that we were on the same page. But it was, I think that the key thing there was we weren't designing everything. We were designing enough to get started, and we were willing to change all of those decisions when the code told us better, right? When we're refactoring, when we realized that maybe our ideas, didn't fit, right? They were great on the whiteboard, but as we were coding, some things changed. So we're willing to change that. We're not so, invested in those designs because they're lightweight. And the same goes for the architecture, right? You're not as invested in it if it doesn't all have to be the same. If you don't have to kind of cookie cutter your architecture out, then you're not as invested in it so that you can actually change when you need to.
Yeah.
That over standardization, I think, is a big problem, both with process and with your kind of technology stack. There's this belief I see in companies I've worked with and companies that I've coached over and over again, that this idea of standardization is some type of either a process optimization or technology optimization. And in some cases it can be helpful. But again, the idea is, right, it's not, we don't want to be polarized into the extreme, right? If everything has to be standard, you're not leaving room for innovation and experimenting and trying new things.
If you have to copy and paste to get to where you're going, if you have to ask permission to get to where you're going, probably you're not doing anything lightweight.
That's
Just
right.
as a side note too, I got a message that there's some utility work going on around me. So if I drop, I will be right back. I just have to switch to my hotspot.
Shall we move on to talk about enabling practices, maybe?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So, these are the things that can help you get to a place of doing evolutionary design, of doing lightweight design. These are the things that support and provide, a safety net around this kind of fast, small chunk iteration, which I know I keep saying the small chunk, but it just seems so obvious to me personally, is that a lot of these arguments between doing all this right now or doing nothing at all, it's not real. It's all the same sorts of things in smaller chunks. That's really the only difference between so many of these practices. Anyways, let me get off my soapbox here. So some practices that, kind of help us move forward in this way is the way that you slice your stories. First of all, up front, I see a lot of teams that will do it by an entire feature, the whole thing, the whole feature, like finished beautiful acoustic guitar feature. I also see some teams that do it like it's layers. So we need a database. That's a story. We need a REST endpoint. That's a story. We need a web page. That's a story. Those things are great and needed, obviously, but they're not delivering anything to anyone. You're not getting any feedback on that.
So John, I noticed John Kern has a couple comments I think are kind of right on the money with what we're talking about right now. So one should make pragmatic choices, not dogmatic choices.
Yep.
That's great, right? And he says he uses the phrase "sneak up on the answer." So I think those are great, couple great comments there to kind of think about how we approach this way of working.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, story slicing is huge. Also, test-driven development. I know, there's always a lot of controversy around test-driven development, and it's unfortunate because for me in my career, and I didn't learn it until I was already programming for 10 years, and it changed the trajectory of my career. And to me, it's it along with evolutionary design is one of the most important practices, and I think it's tied so closely to evolutionary design because evolutionary design applies the concepts of TDD at all levels of design. So I kind of describe TDD as like evolutionary design in the small, right? Because like when you're working on a story or even a task where you're slicing a story down into individual tasks, you're thinking about what is the essence of the story? Where do I start? Like, what's the first test that I write? That's always a question when I'm coaching teams on TDD. They're like, where do I start? I don't know how to start. So kind of figuring out what is the essence of that. You're doing that at a larger level when you're doing evolutionary design. So I think the more you practice TDD and the more comfortable you get with it, you will see that your evolutionary design skills are going to improve hand in hand with that.
Yeah, I love that analogy too, because both of those things, just on like a psychological level, both of those practices for me relieve so much stress. I don't have to keep 100 million things in my head. I don't have to remember, next month, this and that. I can focus on what I'm doing now
That's right.
in both of those practices. That's a great parallel.
So some other enabling practices, I think, so there's a side effect to TDD, and we can also talk about behavior-driven development as well as another enabling practice. The side effects, right? The tests aren't the purpose, which is, I think, another, misconception of what TDD and BDD are. The tests are the artifact, the visible artifact. So we often get confused and think that's the goal, but it is a side effect, but a very, very useful side effect. So having a trusted test suite is something that's going to enable you to do this as well, right? If you have automated tests, that helps you work in an iterative way. That helps you be able to work in this way. If you don't, you're going to take a bigger step, right? So if everything you do is manual testing and it's time intensive and it's all hands on deck, well, then you're going to take a bigger step, right? So you're not going to get those faster feedback loops. So you're going to end up doing try and push every idea into this feature before you release it. So the more you can have things in your way of working that gets you faster feedback, then that's going to enable you to work in this way. That's one of the things I love to tell people. There are no absolutes in software development, except for one, that is faster feedback is better than slower feedback.
Right.
That is a hill I will die on. If you can, anything you can do with your process and your practices to get faster feedback is going to benefit you, and then of course benefit your customers as well.
Yep, absolutely. Did you want to talk about BDD a little bit, or we're getting there?
How are we on time? I think I'm okay with leaving that there. I think BD, other than BDD is kind of, I often think of BDD as kind of larger scale TDD, and the side effect there of having even more tests is you're just kind of embellishing your test suite so that you can rely on it. So when your test suite passes, you feel confident that your code is shippable.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and you can experiment too. Like, I wonder what would happen if I changed this thing, and you maybe you don't want, maybe it's a spike, right? So I'm going to change this little bit of code, and then I'm going to run the test suite, TDD and BDD, just everything, and see what breaks, because that will help inform me about how this system is set up. Maybe I'm new to the project. It's really a safety net that I don't have otherwise.
The one other, I think, important enabling practice that I think about a lot is ensemble programming. I think ensemble programming or mob programming with TDD is like where the magic happens in teams, when you can combine those two things. And one of the keys that I think is really important, and I think if we talk about obstacles, we'll talk about the flip side of this, is including architects in the development. So if your architects are in another department or on another team or on their own team, I'm not going to say that can never work, but that's a challenge, because you want those architects engaged in what's actually being built. It's too easy in organizations to have a separate department of architects that's waterfalling finalized perfect architectures on the development team. And if that happens, you've no chance to do a lightweight architecture, because it's just like the story I told with the organization we were doing the assessment with, was those were finalized architectures that were handed off to teams, and the architects weren't feeling the pain of those decisions. So the more you can bring people, if the team is comfortable with working in a collaborative way, if you can get architects in those ensembles, even if they're not part of the team, that's where you can start actually bringing their skills to bear, so that you can actually build out a lightweight architecture.
And then they can see the feedback of their work, which is good. And, just one more side note, a lot of people say that that's something they can't do because their architects are working on too many things. I think that's a WIP problem that you should probably address regardless of what other practices you're doing. But this all segues pretty well into a question that Josh had just posted. What if the architecture isn't evolving well? How do you handle that? Well, we just talked about one way. Another way, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was in agreement. Yeah. So including the architects in the work is one way to bring their skills to bear, right? So hopefully that will help prevent a situation like this from happening.
Yeah, another way is, regular check-ins. If your team isn't ensembling often, if your team isn't doing some of these other things, a bridge, a gap step might be maybe you have like a regular architecture retrospective where the people who are all contributing to the same system can get together and make sure they're on the same page and talk about where they're seeing pain, where they might need to change, if they need a different library, you know what I mean? And if you're not using a lightweight architecture already, that might be a rough time.
Make it harder to change. Yeah.
But still an important one.
Yeah. So I think it's a great advice. Having those retrospectives is important, and you can decide, right, is the Kern architecture no longer meeting our needs? Or, you may know, at some point we can't keep using whatever, library X. We know at some point we need to change the way we're doing this. And I don't know if it's, maybe we need to add a caching layer at some point. So being aware of when that is and having regular check-ins to figure out when is the appropriate time, right? In the old agile mantra of the last responsible moment. When is it responsible for us to add this? We know it's going to add more complexity to our system, but when do we need this? So being able to have something like that, a regular check-in, is going to help you avoid having no architecture once you get started.
Yeah, I want to pop up this comment from Tim as well. Changing is almost always perceived as an emotional toil, so people will often try to justify working as they're accustomed rather than in a way that serves the product community better, which is the main resistance to evolutionary design. I think that's an interesting point, because as with so many of these things, and you can see it in the arguments on LinkedIn, people get emotionally invested in how they write software, which is secondarily so super interesting to me. But this is a pretty good point. Change is hard.
Yeah.
It just is, no matter what.
And I think think about it, it's not just developers too, it's also like product managers as well. I think that if you have to work differently, that is a challenge for them as well. I've certainly worked in organizations where the product department was there to stand between the developers and the customer. So you had the kind of telephone game for everything. So getting that feedback, if at all, some product organizations, they had no connection to their customers. So you would either get no feedback, or what you would get would be kind of like whisper down the lane in the form of, a specification written and delivered to the team. So that's also, if you're bringing that with you and that's how you're used to working, that can be emotional as well. Like, oh my gosh, I had one product manager say, what if the developer says something stupid? And it's like, well, let's live, we're all adults here. Why don't we just, when we get feedback from our users, we can worry less about if someone says something stupid. So I totally agree. I think that is a great point, Tim.
But I think that's the other interesting thing. We're talking about making change easier. We're not talking about making change never hard. It will always be hard, no matter what. I think it's important to recognize that it will always be hard, and then explore opportunities that will make it easier, even within that context, like having things be lightweight, having just what you need for now, instead of having to carry around, like you said, the cruise ship. Change is going to be hard either way. There's always going to be emotional toil, to Tim's point, but it's important to try to have a coping strategy for that. That's my word from therapy. Have a coping strategy for that in the form of lightweight design, lightweight architecture.
That's right.
Yeah.
If nothing else, those of us who are developers, the lighter weight architecture, the lighter weight design, the less it is for us to maintain. So at least the daily maintenance of that code that we're writing should hopefully be a little more enjoyable if you're not carrying around all of this extra code.
Yeah, and the less of a Jenga tower you have where you change one thing and something over there fell down.
That's right.
Because it's all secretly interrelated in a way that nobody necessarily wanted or agreed to begin with, but because you have to have this whole big thing up front, you now have to deal with and maintain.
Great. I think it's probably a good idea to talk a little bit about obstacles. I think we've already been covering them, I think, throughout the talk here. So I think it's and a lot of it might be maybe just the opposite of these enabling practices. So we talked about, how you're organized is important. So, how are the architects organized versus the rest of the teams? Is your organization like if the only thing you can generate is an upfront architecture, right? Because the architects are totally separate and they're just building, maybe they're PowerPoint architects and they're just waterfalling those final architectures onto the teams. That's going to prevent you from doing this. So the more that you can get people working together in the code, so collaboration happening at the time of code creation, the more opportunity you're going to have to work in this evolutionary way.
And again, I can see that happening in a lot of organizations because those people are stretched very thin. They're responsible for architecting, 8, 10 different systems. Again, you're not solving the right problem if you're avoiding having them join a team.
Also thinking about how teams are organized, as Amber was talking about with the idea of slicing, and there's a story for the database and a story for the REST endpoint. If your teams are organized around components, if they're organized by technology, if you have back-end teams and front-end teams and database teams, if one team can't deliver a feature end to end, you're not going to be able to evolve it, right? You're going to have to work them in pieces and then try to integrate them later. And now you're back with that integration risk, that big risk at the end right before you want to release. So thinking about how you're organized, optimizing for a way where you can work continuously in an iterative way is important. And then I think we don't spend enough time thinking how much the way we are organized affects the work that we do.
Yeah, I've seen a shocking amount. I know I just keep going on tangents, but I've seen a shocking amount of resistance just within the software side of things, the writing code side of things. A front-end team and a back-end team don't want to share each other's work and don't want to learn about each other's work. And it drives me kind of insane because it's all just code. One side is not magical and different. It's just a different syntax. Sometimes it's not even a different syntax. It's the same language. It boggles the mind.
And when you, not to sound like a broken record here, but when you do things like ensemble programming, you can bring all those skills together. So I don't have to be the expert in both the back end and the front end, as long as we have an expert with us.
Yes.
And that's how you start to build out the T-shaped people, right? You can be an expert in one area, but you can hold your own in the other areas as well.
That's exactly
that's super important.
Yeah. And I think that's probably the case across disciplines, which is why this sort of cross-functional ensembling, along with, developing and designing the lightweight architecture along the way, is so vital.
Okay, we talked about a few others, right? Over standardization. If you're coming in with a standard architecture before you even start, you're gonna have to think differently about your architecture for this to work. If you've no way to work incrementally and iteratively, and so right, if you can't do CI/CD and not just I don't mean having a build pipeline or a server called a CI server, but actually being able to on commit, go through your build pipeline.
Chunk-based development you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly, right? So if on commit you can't actually trigger a build and have it run your tests, then you have trusted test suites. That's going to make that harder. We talked about connections to customers, right? If you have no connection to customer, getting that feedback is impossible. So that's important. In addition to what they tell you, telemetry in your system is also really important, so you can see what they're doing and analyze that as well, because both are important.
Yeah.
The last bit that I wanted, and I know we're probably coming up on time, the last bit I wanted to talk about was programming by coincidence. I think that is the term that came out of the Pragmatic Programmer book, and I love it. I think a lot of teams don't work this way because they're used to working programming by coincidence. So they create a branch, isolate themselves from everything else, copy code from somewhere that looked like something they need to do, and they tweak it and tweak it and tweak it until it magically works. And obviously that's not going to work. That's not going to help us work in a more evolutionary way. So really thinking about, if that's the way you work, working more deliberately. How can we work more deliberately? Yeah, bringing more heads into the problem usually helps. So things like ensemble development will help. So I think those are some things that we see kind of prevent organizations from being able to do this practice, or say, "Yeah, this just can't work here." Well, it
Yeah.
can, but you need to look at what are the things that are preventing it.
Yeah. So we are right at time now. So I'm just going to do a quick wrap up here, which is just, thank you guys. We could talk for hours about this, obviously. But thank you guys for joining us. Thank you for coming. Please feel free to still leave comments. We will continue to exist after this live event and are more than happy to keep talking about it, asynchronously in comments or email or wherever it is. And we'll see you at the next one.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.